It was supposed to be a quick meeting. Drop off the reports, go over the necessary revisions, and leave. That's all. But as I stood outside Hazel's door, my heart beat a little faster than usual. Hazel wasn't like anyone else I'd ever worked for. She had a presence that commanded attention, an aura of authority that seemed untouchable. Her posture was always perfect, her words sharp and deliberate, and her gaze. Oh, her gaze. It had a way of cutting straight through me, like she could see past every carefully constructed defense I'd built. It wasn't just her professionalism. It was the way she carried herself, as if nothing could shake her. And yet, beneath that polished exterior, there was something else. Something I couldn't quite name, but couldn't stop thinking about. I knocked on the door, clutching the folder of reports tightly in my hands. When the door opened, the woman standing before me wasn't the Hazel I was used to. She wasn't wearing one of her signature tailored suits or the heels that echoed through the office halls. Instead, she wore a loose sweater that hugged her in all the right places and a pair of dark jeans. Her hair, usually tied back in a sleek bun, fell softly around her shoulders. And then there was her smile, not the polite, professional one I was accustomed to, but something softer, warmer. "Come in," she said, her voice lower than usual, almost inviting. I stepped inside, immediately enveloped by the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Her home was immaculate, just like I'd imagined, but it wasn't sterile or cold. There was a warmth to the space, bookshelves lined with novels, a plush sofa with a throw draped casually over the arm, and soft lighting that made the whole room feel intimate. "Sorry to ask you to do this after hours," she said, gesturing toward the couch as she closed the door behind me. "But I thought it would be easier to go through everything here." "It's no problem," I said quickly, my voice sounding higher than usual. I sat down on the sofa, the soft cushions sinking slightly beneath me. Hazel moved to a chair across from me, her movements fluid and confident as she took the reports from my hands. She began flipping through them, her brow furrowing in concentration. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but it was impossible. The way the light caught in her hair, the way her lips pursed ever so slightly when she came across something she didn't like, it was all so distracting. And then there was the way her eyes sparkled when she glanced up at me, like she knew exactly what she was doing to me. "You're quiet tonight," she said suddenly, her tone light but curious. "Oh, just tired," I lied, adjusting my posture to appear more composed. Hazel's lips twitched, almost forming a smirk. "Long week." "Something like that," I replied, hoping my voice sounded casual, even as my heart raced. She nodded, her eyes lingering on me for a moment longer before returning to the papers in her lap. I tried to steady my breathing, forcing myself to focus on anything other than the magnetic pull of her presence. But it was impossible. Hazel wasn't just my boss, she was a force. And sitting here in her home, watching her study those reports with the same precision and care she brought to everything, I couldn't help but feel completely out of my depth. This woman, so controlled, so confident, left me utterly undone. And the worst part, she had no idea. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Because if Hazel did know, she wasn't just my boss anymore. She was something much, much more dangerous. "Are you okay?" "You seem distracted," Hazel asked, her voice cutting through my spiraling thoughts. I looked up sharply, startled by the question. She hadn't lifted her gaze from the report she was reading, but the faint smile on her lips made it clear she knew she'd caught me off guard. "Yes, I'm fine," I lied, adjusting my posture in a futile attempt to appear more composed. "Just thinking about the presentation." Her lips twitched slightly, as if amused by my obvious deflection. She set the papers down on the coffee table, leaning forward with her elbows resting on her knees. Her gaze finally met mine, and the intensity in her eyes made my breath hitch. "You know," she began, her voice low, almost conspiratorial, "you've been doing an incredible job lately. I don't think I've told you that enough." The compliment threw me off balance. Hazel wasn't the kind of person who handed out praise freely. She was demanding, always expecting the best, and rarely took the time to acknowledge it when you met her standards. I started, but the words caught in my throat. "Thank you." Before I could say more, she stood and walked toward the kitchen. I watched her go, my thoughts racing as I tried to make sense of the shift in her tone. There was something about the way she'd said it, so personal, so uncharacteristically warm, that made my heart race. A moment later, she returned, holding 2 glasses of wine. The deep red liquid shimmered in the low light as she handed one to me. "It's Friday night," she said with a small smile, settling back onto the couch. I think we deserve a little break, don't you? I hesitated, the weight of the situation suddenly pressing down on me. This was unusual, unprofessional even. But the warmth in her smile and the ease with which she carried herself made it impossible to refuse. Sure, I said finally, taking the glass and hoping she couldn't see the faint tremor in my hand. She shifted closer, closing the gap between us as she lifted her glass. To hard work, she said, her voice light but tinged with something deeper. To hard work, I echoed, clinking my glass against hers. As I took a sip, her fingers brushed against mine. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me that was impossible to ignore. My heart pounded as I fought to steady my breathing, grateful for the wine in my hand as an excuse to look away. Hazel set her glass down on the table, turning slightly to face me. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, lower, as if sharing a secret. You do know you're much more than just efficient at what you do, don't you? The words hung in the air between us, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. I searched her face, trying to discern her intent, but her expression was calm, her gaze steady. Thank you, I said again, my voice quieter this time, tinged with uncertainty. She smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips that made my stomach flip. You're always so modest, she said, her tone almost playful. It's one of the things I admire about you. Admire. The word echoed in my mind, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to confront. The space between us seemed smaller now, the air thicker. Hazel's gaze lingered on mine, and I felt a nervous energy building in the pit of my stomach, a tension I couldn't ignore. I wanted to say something, to steer the conversation back to safe, professional territory, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I sat there, caught in the intensity of her gaze, the faint smile playing on her lips, and the undeniable shift in the dynamic between us. My breathing grew shallow as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The air between us felt heavier, charged with something unspoken, but impossible to ignore. Hazel's gaze was fixed on me, more intense than I'd ever seen, as if she were waiting for something, some sign, some response. Thank you, I managed to say, but my voice came out quieter than I'd intended, trembling with uncertainty. She tilted her head, a small smile curving her lips. It wasn't her usual polite, professional smile. It was something softer, more personal. It made my chest tighten. You've always been so modest, she said, her tone laced with something almost playful. It's one of the things I admire most about you. Admire. There was that word again, and this time, the weight behind it was undeniable. The room felt smaller now, the space between us shrinking even though neither of us had moved much. I watched as Hazel lifted her glass, took a slow sip of wine, and then placed it back on the table with deliberate care. When she leaned toward me, just slightly, my pulse quickened, the faint sound of my own heartbeat filling my ears. I've wanted to say this before, she said, her voice lower now, more intimate. But I thought it would be inappropriate. Her words hung in the air, and I swallowed hard, my fingers clutching the stem of my wineglass as if it were the only thing keeping me grounded. Say what? I asked, though my voice barely rose above a whisper. Her hesitation was brief but palpable, as if she were weighing the consequences of her next words. When she finally spoke, her gaze didn't waver, holding mine in a way that made it impossible to look away. That you have something special, she said softly. Something I can't ignore. Her words landed with a quiet force, and the tension in the room grew even thicker. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe properly, as her meaning began to sink in. I searched her face for answers, for some indication that I was misreading the moment, but all I saw was the steady resolve in her eyes. There was no mistaking what she meant, no room for ambiguity. The silence that followed was deafening. My thoughts raced, colliding with one another as I tried to figure out how to respond. Hazel was my boss, my superior, the person I was supposed to admire from a distance. Not someone I could allow myself to think about in this way. But the way she was looking at me now, as if she could see every thought I was trying to suppress, made it impossible to cling to that distance. Her gaze held mine, unwavering, and I felt my chest tighten further, torn between the growing tension and the undeniable pull toward her. I stood abruptly, the tension between us overwhelming. My hands fidgeted at my sides as I tried to find something, anything, to do with myself that didn't involve meeting Hazel's gaze. I need some air, I mumbled, the excuse sounding weak even to my own ears. I took a step toward the door, hoping to escape the weight of the moment, but before I could take another, Hazel was beside me. Her hand reached out, lightly brushing against my arm, and the warmth of her touch stopped me in my tracks. "Wait," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I turned toward her, my breath catching at the look in her eyes. Open, vulnerable, and yet somehow filled with a quiet strength. "I don't want you to feel like I'm pressuring you," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "That's not what this is. But I needed to be honest about how I feel. I couldn't keep it to myself anymore." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I stood frozen, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Hazel, the woman I'd admired for her confidence, her poise, her unshakable presence, was standing here now, completely unguarded. The person I'd once thought of as distant and unattainable was looking at me as if I was the one thing she couldn't resist. "Hazel, this is," I started, but the words faltered on my tongue. She must have seen the confusion on my face because she stepped back slightly, letting her hand fall from my arm. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice tinged with regret. "I shouldn't have said anything." Her retreat broke something in me, a thread pulled too tight finally snapping. Without thinking, without planning, I closed the distance between us. My hand cupped her face, and before I could second-guess myself, I kissed her. The moment our lips met, it was like a switch flipped. Everything else, my doubts, my fears, the professional lines I'd tried so hard to keep intact, fell away. Her lips were soft, warm, and she responded immediately, her hands resting lightly on my waist as the kiss deepened. Every fiber of my body seemed to come alive at her touch, and I couldn't stop myself from leaning closer, wanting more. When we finally broke apart, our breaths were uneven, the air between us charged with an intensity one couldn't ignore. Hazel's eyes searched mine, her expression a mixture of surprise and something deeper, something raw. I started again, but she interrupted me, her voice steady despite the rapid rise and fall of her chest. "I want you," she said, her words simple but filled with conviction. I didn't pull away, didn't hesitate, as her hands found their way to the hem of my blouse. The room around us seemed to blur, the only thing that mattered was her. The way her touch sent shivers down my spine, the way her breath mingled with mine. I let myself get lost in the moment, in her, as everything else faded into the background. When her lips had traced across my body, it was like she had unlocked something I hadn't realized was there, a deep, raw need that I didn't know how to describe. It wasn't just the physical sensations, it was the way she moved, deliberate and confident, but with an edge of tenderness that left me completely disarmed. I had never experienced anything like it. Every kiss, every touch, left me breathless, unable to focus on anything except the overwhelming sensation of her presence. And when she finally reached that most vulnerable part of me, I could hardly believe what I was feeling. It was almost too much, pleasure that consumed me entirely, leaving me shaking, clutching at her, as if holding her closer would somehow steady the storm raging through me. And when I thought I'd reached my limit, she showed me there was still more. More to feel, more to give, more to experience. By the time it was over, I was left gasping, every part of me undone. My heart raced, my body still humming, but all I could think was more. I wanted more of her, more of that connection, more of the way she made me feel like the world had disappeared, and it was just us. The rest of the night was a blur of warmth and intimacy. I didn't know where she ended, and I began. It was all a hazy, beautiful mix of whispers and stolen kisses. When I finally fell asleep, it was with a sense of completeness I'd never known before. But morning came too soon. I dressed quietly, my movements slow as I tried to gather my thoughts. Every word she'd said, every look she'd given me, played over and over in my mind. I couldn't help but smile as I thought about the way she'd held me, the way she'd whispered my name like it was something sacred. When I stepped outside, the cool morning air hit me, waking me up fully. My thoughts felt scattered, as if I were trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The short drive home was a blur. Even as I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee in front of me, I couldn't focus on anything but her. Hazel. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. The way she looked at me with such intensity, the way her smile softened when she thought I wasn't paying attention, the way her hands felt against my skin. I didn't know what this meant, what we were now. All I knew was that something inside me had shifted. A door I hadn't realized was there had been opened, and I couldn't imagine ever closing it again. My phone buzzed on the table, pulling me out of my thoughts. I reached for it, my heart skipping a beat when I saw her name. Dinner tonight? 2 simple words, but they carried so much weight. I stared at the screen, a smile slowly forming as warmth spread through my chest. I didn't hesitate as I typed my response. Sounds perfect. As I hit send, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. Whatever this was, whatever came next, I was ready. I didn't know where this path with Hazel would lead, but I was certain of one thing. I didn't want to turn back. This wasn't just a change in our relationship. It was a change in me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly alive.